King of the South, and this is at the time of the end. Then it says, and the king of the north shall come against him, the king of the south, like a whirlwind with chariots, horsemen, and ships. Like a whirlwind with chariots, horsemen, and ships. And then it says, he shall enter the countries, shall overflow and pass over. The way this verse is structured, it says at the time of the end, two things happen. The first thing that happens is that this event occurs, and then we have the time of the end also spoken here, where this event occurs. The date for this event is 1798, and the date for this event is not actually a specific date, okay? It's more of an event. The reason we know that is because according to Revelation chapter 10, time should be no longer. So we're not looking at a date. A lot of people put down 1989 for this date. Most people use that date, but I'm going to use a date from 1989 to 1991. It actually is a period of history, and it's not a date that we're marking, but an event. Okay, so we're looking at the event. So it's because there's no more time prophecies. So that's the structure of that verse, and interestingly enough, this idea of going from, let me give you this power here. This is the USSR, and this is the papacy. The USSR and the papacy.
No.
Sorry? Oh, sorry, I got it the wrong way around. Okay. I was just going through the papacy and the USSR. Is that correct? Okay, yeah, I've put Egypt here, and I should have already put France. Any more questions? No. Any more mistakes? Okay. Interestingly enough, let me give you the structure from verses 40 to 45, just a quick overview of this, okay? The quick overview is you have 40, 41, 42, 43, 44, and 45. And remember, scenes similar to the ones that we already discussed in 30 to 36 are going to occur. In verse 40, you have 1798, and then you have the fall of the USSR in 40 part B. This is the king of the south. In verse 41, you have a national Sunday law in the United States. Verse 42, you have a national Sunday law in the world. And the history from verses 43, 44 and 45, especially these two histories here, are really connected with this national Sunday law. So, although this is the waymark for it, this history here is connected to it, so you could compress these and put them together. It shows you the consequences of that national Sunday law. And this here talks about the end of the papacy. So that's an overview. Now these two National Sunday laws, number 1 and number 2, the argument always centres around an interpretation of these two verses, 41 and 42, of what these mean. But if you go to Revelation 13, everybody agrees that at the end of the world, the papacy is going to rise up, you're going to have a second lamb-like beast, and they're going to join forces together, and they're going to create a Sunday law, first in the United States, and then in the world. Doesn't everybody agree with that? It's clearly explained in great controversy. And then you have the end of the world, because you go into Revelation 14. So that sequence of events that are given in Revelation 13 and 14, that sequence is exactly the same as the sequence that we're suggesting happens in these verses here. That you have the Sunday law in the United States, the Sunday law in the world, and then the papacy comes to its end. The information that's not given anywhere else is this information. And this information in verse 40 is the information that kicks everything off, that starts all of these events ticking off and starting, is verse 40. And this occurred, as I said, between the time period of 1989 to 91, when the USSR fell in a succession of events. This history here is a waymark for all these events that are going to occur. And in almost any dialogue that I've had with anybody, except those who agree with Uriah Smith's position, almost everybody agrees that this event is marked in verse 40. Is there anybody here who's had any discussion with anybody that ever disagreed with that? No? I take that as a no. Hardly anybody disagrees with that. People who are vehemently opposed to this message and the understanding of these verses, they all agree with this. And that's interesting. And the reason why they agree with it is because they haven't accepted that this event here, as this here was the time of the end, they have not accepted intellectually that this also is the time of the end. What they see is that a time of the end occurred in 1798, and then you just get a progression of events after that. And they just see 1989, I'll use that date 1988 because it's convenient, as just another event afterwards. And they don't see 1989 as a time of the end. Does that make sense to everybody? But from my understanding, that the verse is really structured that way to make it, to show us clearly that at the time of the end this occurs and also this occurs. Two events occur at the time of the end. That's the way this verse is structured. And once you accept that intellectually, you begin to struggle with the acceptance of this truth. The reason why you struggle with the acceptance of this truth is because when you take the history of the Millerites, which went from 1798 to 1844, everybody are familiar with that? This is the Millerite history. Just a simple basic understanding is, it says this was the parable of the 10 virgins. Ellen White says that the parable of the 10 virgins was fulfilled in the Millerite history. For Christ Object Lessons, I believe. She says that parable... No? Great controversy. I won't go into it. If someone finds the page, they can do that. The Millerite history was the parable of the 10 virgins was fulfilled in the Millerite history, and she says that parable will be fulfilled again in the future. So when you take that history of the Millerites, where this marks at the time of the end, without a correct understanding of verse 40, as Adventists, we have come to the realize, or the acceptance, that when it says the parable of the 10 virgins will be repeated, we're not able to use that information for any useful purpose. Because when it's going to get repeated in the future, after 1844, you have to ask yourself the question, when did it get repeated? Because the parable has a start and it has an end. Everybody agree with that? Okay, however you're going to get that interpretation and bring it into the future, you have to ask yourself the question, when did it start? Because it started in 1798 and ended in 1844, in the Millerite history, but when did it start? Because we're in 2011, and Daniel 12:1 is over here, and we don't know that length of time period, and we don't have a start point.
I've got a quote that's the right one. The Biant held August 19, 1890. Says the parable has been and will be fulfilled.
Okay, Review and Herald.
August 19, 1890.
August 19, 1890. And it says the parable has been fulfilled and will be. Okay, so if you accept that the parable of the 10 virgins was fulfilled there, and this is, from my understanding, one of the most powerful things that we need to understand of this message, because if you don't accept this, you're just having a dialogue with somebody, is that the parable of the 10 virgins, when it gets repeated, must be repeated when the time of the end starts again. Without that understanding of how to apply the parable, it's almost useless information. Does everybody understand that? Yeah? So that's why verse 40 is structured. It says at the time of the end, two events happen. One of them happens in 1798, when France brings down the papacy, and the second event, which happens at the time of the end, happens when the papacy brings down the USSR, and that event occurred around 1989, and that marks the time of the end.
How do you define the time of the end?
Okay, well, I'll quickly do that in a moment. Actually, I might not do, because we define that on Friday night. On Friday night we define it. I'll quickly go over it again. But however we define that, okay, I think I know why you're asking the question. Okay, so we might not be in agreement. So I'm suggesting in 1989, the time of the end began again.
No, I agree with that.
Okay.
Maybe the reason why there's a controversy, because some people say the time of the end is the ending of the time prophecy.
It is.
So there's no more ending of the time prophecies after 1844.
Yes.
So how come 1989? I agree with the phraseology of it, the way you're using the phrase. What I'm saying is, if it's the ending of the time prophecy, no time prophecy ever ended in 1989.
I'm in total agreement with this. The techniques or the prophetic rules that we're using after 1844 are different to the ones that the Millerites used. We're using different verses. Okay? The verses that they used are different to the verses we use, but we're using them in a similar fashion. Okay? I'll just explain that simply. Their message was the message of Revelation 14, the first and second angel's message, was it not? Yeah. But if you look at their writings, they never preached from Revelation 14. They preached Daniel 8:14. So you know that the message of Daniel 8:14 is the first and second angel's message. Okay? We claim, or there's a claim, that this message here, Daniel 11:40-45, is the third angel's message. If people argue against that, they will say the third angel's message is from Revelation 14. But if we're going to repeat history, which the parable of the 10 virgins says that we're going to, okay, we're going to be using the same techniques that they did. They take a prophecy from the Revelation and use a verse from Daniel as a substitute. They don't actually quote from Revelation. We're doing the same thing. That's one of the arguments about... I'm going to stop because I think I'm losing people there. The time of the end is in 1798. The time of the end repeats and takes you to the fall of the USSR. And I put 1989 as a waymark. Without that understanding, you struggle to line up the events that we need to line up. Because we need to line up the national Sunday law in America, the worldwide Sunday law, and then the close of probation after that. So that's a powerful piece of understanding that we need to get to grips with. See in verse 40. Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 to 8. Don't turn to it because I'm just going to read. And I'm just actually going to paraphrase from those verses. Genesis chapter 12, verse 8. And the point I'm trying to make here is that Egypt is the south. The king of the south is Egypt. We're going to try and prove that. It says, Abraham came out of Babylon. He comes out by receiving the everlasting gospel, and he exercised righteousness by faith. So this coming out of Egypt is an exercise